In the autumn of 1944, in a quiet wood near the German town of Grafenwöhr, an American jeep was rolling slowly between the trees. The driver wore a wool field jacket with the markings of the United States Army. The men beside him spoke English in clean Midwestern accents. Their helmets, their rifles, their ration tins, their cigarettes, all of it was American. Only one thing was wrong. Every man in that jeep was a soldier of the German Wehrmacht. Among the crates piled in the back of that jeep was a small green wooden box, no larger than a lunch pail. Inside it sat a device the German army had been chasing for nearly 2 years, a device that the most powerful radio industry in continental Europe had failed to copy. One American sergeant could carry it on his back and use it to call down artillery fire from 5 miles away, while German signals officers, listening with the most sophisticated intercept service in the world, heard nothing but silence on their headphones. That device was an American walkie-talkie. And the story of what the Germans learned from it, and what they could not learn from it, is one of the strangest and most overlooked chapters of the Second World War. The device they were studying had a long official name, Radio Set SCR-300. The men who built it called it the BC-1000. The American soldiers who carried it gave it a nickname that would outlive the war itself, the walkie-talkie. With its battery, the set weighed about 38 pounds and stood roughly 1.5 feet tall on a man's back. Inside its green metal case were 18 vacuum tubes, and it could talk in clear, static, free voice across more than 5 miles of open country between 2 infantrymen who could not see each other, who did not share a wire, and who had never used a radio before in their lives. Beside the SCR-300, the United States Army carried a smaller cousin, the SCR-536, also known as the BC-611. The 536 was a true handheld set, weighing 5 pounds, about the size of a heavy thermos flask, with a telescoping antenna that turned the radio on when you pulled it out and turned it off when you pushed it back in. It had no volume control and no dial, just one fixed channel, set by a crystal at the divisional radio shop. A platoon leader could hold it to his ear with one hand while gripping his Thompson submachine gun with the other. By the time the war in Europe ended, more than 130,000 of those little radios had rolled out of the Galvin manufacturing factory in Chicago, Illinois. The story of these 2 radios begins not on a battlefield, but in a peacetime laboratory on West Harrison Street in Chicago, Illinois, in the late 1930s. The man who pushed the project forward inside the company was Daniel Noble, an electrical engineer from Naugatuck, Connecticut, who had taught at Connecticut State College for more than a decade, before joining Galvin Manufacturing as its director of research. The chief radio frequency engineer was a Polish radio specialist named Henryk Magnuski. Magnuski had been sent to New York by his employer, the State Tele and Radio Technical Works of Warsaw, in June 1939, to study American radio designs. When Germany invaded Poland that September, he found himself stranded in the United States. He took a job with Galvin Manufacturing in Chicago, and within 2 years he was holding the most important engineering pencil in the company's history. The decision that shaped everything came not from these engineers alone, but from a single United States Army officer named Roger Colton. Colton, who would end the war as a major general, was the director of the Signal Corps engineering laboratories at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. In 1938, against the entire weight of military tradition, against the resistance of the established American radio industry, and against the advice of officers who had built their careers on the older technology, Colton made a single decision. Every future tactical ground radio of the United States Army would use a new form of broadcasting called frequency modulation. The decision was not popular. It was not safe. It was, in the words of the inventor of frequency modulation, Edwin Howard Armstrong, the most difficult decision of the history of radio which anyone was ever called upon to make. Armstrong wrote those words in a letter to Colton on June 29, 1944, 3 weeks after American soldiers carrying the fruits of that decision had stormed ashore at Normandy. To understand why this decision mattered, you need to understand what the world of military radio looked like before 1938. Every army on Earth used a system called amplitude modulation, the same kind of broadcast that carried news and music to civilian radios in every kitchen from London to Tokyo. Amplitude modulation was simple, well understood, and reliable enough to send Morse code halfway around the planet. But it had one fatal weakness. It carried noise. Every spark from an engine ignition, every crackle of distant lightning, every hum from a power line, every burst from another transmitter on the same frequency, all of it came through the receiver mixed with the human voice. On a quiet farm in peacetime, this was a minor irritation. On a battlefield, surrounded by tank engines and artillery fire and 100 other radios all shouting at once, it was a death sentence for clear communication. Frequency modulation. The system Edwin Armstrong had patented in 1933 did something different. Instead of varying the strength of the radio wave to carry the voice, it varied its frequency. The voice rode on the rhythm of the wave, not its loudness. And because of this, a frequency-modulated receiver could be built with a circuit called a limiter, which simply chopped off the noise spikes before they ever reached the listener. The result was a kind of clean, quiet voice that no army on Earth had ever heard come out of a battlefield radio. Two transmitters on the same channel did not blend into chaos. The stronger one captured the receiver completely. Engineers called this the capture effect. American sergeants in the field would simply call it a miracle. Colton's decision in 1938 set the United States Army on a path that no other military followed. By March 1942, the first frequency-modulated combat radio, the SCR-508, was rolling into American tanks. By the summer of 1943, the SCR-300 was ready for the infantry. The first American soldiers to carry it into combat were Marines and the men of the United States Army's 43rd and 37th Infantry Divisions, fighting through the dense jungle of New Georgia in the Solomon Islands in August 1943. The radio that would change the war had arrived. Across the front lines, in the radio rooms of the German army, a very different world was already in place. Germany was not a backward radio nation. By any measure, it was the most sophisticated radio nation in continental Europe, with a tradition stretching from Heinrich Hertz, who first proved the existence of radio waves in the 1880s, through Carl Ferdinand Braun, the Nobel Prize winner of 1909, to the Telefunken Company in Berlin, founded in 1903, and the equal of any radio firm in the world. By 1939, more than 70% of German households owned a radio, the highest density on Earth. The Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, was the propaganda flagship of the Reich, designed by the engineer Otto Griesing in 1933 for the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. The smaller DKE-38, introduced in 1938, was nicknamed Goebbels' Snout, because every German voice on it carried the orders of Joseph Goebbels. The German army was the first in the world to give every tank a radio. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armoured warfare, had insisted on it before the war began. The standard German tank radio, called the FUG-5, operated in the 27 to 33 MHz band, used amplitude modulation, and was made by Telefunken in tens of thousands of units. The Wehrmacht had radios for the infantry as well. The Tornfunk series of backpack sets, the Feldfunksprecher series of small infantry radios, the Kleinfunksprecher, all carefully designed, all robust, all amplitude modulation, and all confined to the same noisy and crowded radio world that every other army still inhabited. For the first 3 years of the war, this did not seem to matter. German signals doctrine worked. Tanks talked to tanks, battalions talked to companies. The blitzkrieg through Poland, France, the Low Countries, the Balkans, and into the depths of the Soviet Union was, in part, a story of radio communication functioning faster and more flexibly than the enemy could match. But somewhere between the autumn of 1942 and the summer of 1943, the world of tactical radio was quietly turned upside down. American factories began shipping a kind of radio that German doctrine had not anticipated, that German industry had not built, and that German signals intelligence had not been trained to defeat. By 1943, German radio intelligence, known in the language of its officers as Funkaufklärung, was an enormous machine. The Army's Signal Intelligence Service, controlled from the high command of the Army by an organization called the General of Signal Intelligence, employed roughly 12,000 men by the end of the war. They were organized into 8 numbered regiments called KONA, an abbreviation of the German term for Commander of Signal Intelligence. Each regiment had subordinate fixed intercept stations, mobile evaluation centers, and long-range signal intelligence companies. KONA-5, covered the Western Front. KON-A7, formed in February 1943, covered Italy. The Funkabwehr, a separate service under the Armed Forces High Command, hunted clandestine transmitters across occupied Europe. Within the Funkabwehr, a unit known as the 615 Company, with the cover name Ursula, was given the specific job of monitoring very high-frequency radio traffic in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. These men were skilled professionals. They were the inheritors of a German radio intelligence tradition that stretched back to the First World War. They had broken or read significant amounts of Allied diplomatic, naval, and military traffic. They had exploited the black code that the American military attaché Bonifellas had used in Cairo in 1941 and 1942, feeding Field Marshal Erwin Rommel a steady stream of British plans in North Africa. They had cracked the rapid teleprinter system, known as the radiotype, used on the American military's main administrative radio network, in roughly 1 week of work at the intercept station at Euskirchen, west of Cologne. By the testimony of their own commander, the German Lieutenant General Albert Prawn, they had encountered no real difficulty in intercepting American radio communications until the summer of 1942. And then something changed. In Prawn's own words, written after the war for the Historical Division of the United States Army, the German Radio Intelligence Service began to encounter a new kind of American radio traffic that did not fit the patterns they had spent 4 years learning to read. The traffic appeared at low, very high frequencies, between roughly 20 and 50 megahertz. It used a modulation system that German receivers, designed for amplitude modulation, did not properly demodulate. And worst of all, it could only be heard from very close to the front line. The long-range direction-finding stations that the Germans had built across Norway, France, Romania, and the Eastern Front, with their giant antenna arrays and their networks of cross-bearings, simply could not pull a fix on it. The reason, the German engineers eventually understood, was physics. The waves that carry amplitude-modulated radio in the high-frequency band, between 3 and 30 megahertz, can bounce off the ionosphere and travel for thousands of miles. A skilled intercept operator at a fixed station in Berlin can hear an American radio in Tunisia, but the very high-frequency waves that the new American sets used did not bounce. They traveled in straight lines, like light, fading away just over the horizon. To intercept an American walkie-talkie, the German listener had to be physically close. To direction-find one, the German operator needed mobile equipment moving with the front line, and that mobile equipment, by the testimony of the Funkabwehr's own 615 Company in post-war Allied interrogations, was simply not up to the task. The unit's official assessment, preserved in declassified intelligence reports, was that locating very high-frequency transmitters by direction finding was, in their own words, considered an exceedingly difficult task. The Germans, in short, had built the wrong kind of intercept service for the war they were now fighting. The first American walkie-talkies began to fall into German hands in significant numbers in late 1943. The exact circumstances vary by theatre. In the Italian campaign, after the Allied landings at Salerno in September, at Anzio in January 1944, and in the slow, grinding battles around Monte Cassino, sets were lost in retreats, in failed assaults, in destroyed command posts. In Normandy, in June 1944, the parachute drops of the 101st and the 82nd Airborne Divisions scattered men, weapons, and radios across miles of Norman hedgerow country. Hundreds of SCR-300s and SCR-536s simply landed in the wrong fields, recovered later, sometimes by Americans, sometimes by Germans. In Operation Market Garden, in September 1944, the airborne assault into the Netherlands left more equipment in German hands. In the Hürtgen Forest, in the fighting at Aachen, in the brutal house-to-house battles along the West Wall, sets changed hands routinely. And in December 1944, in the Schnee-Eifel pocket during the German Ardennes offensive, approximately 7,000 men of the 106th Infantry Division surrendered to the Wehrmacht, taking with them every radio they had carried. What happened to those captured radios when they reached German hands is a question that the surviving record answers only in part, and the answer is far stranger than the popular legend. For decades, an anecdote has circulated in radio collector communities, in popular histories, and in the encyclopedia entries that draw from them. The anecdote says that German engineers, after capturing American walkie-talkies in Sicily in 1943, were deeply impressed by what they found and reported their findings up the chain of command. It is a satisfying story. It fits the dramatic structure of a documentary perfectly. There is only one problem with it. No one, in the entire surviving body of German wartime documents, in the post-war interrogation reports compiled by Allied intelligence, in the official histories of the United States Army Signal Corps, or in the corporate archives of the Galvin Manufacturing Company, has ever produced a primary source for it. The story appears to be a post-war tradition, repeated from one secondary work to another until it acquired the weight of fact. What we do have, when we look honestly at the surviving German record, is something more interesting and more revealing. We have a silence. The German Army's radio research establishment, called the Nachrichtenversuchsregiment, or Signals Trial Regiment, did not produce a major published technical study of the captured American walkie-talkie. The Funkversuchsanstalt, the Heer's main radio development laboratory at Berlin-Schöneberg, did not deliver a public reverse engineering report. Telefunken, Lorenz, Saba, and the other German radio firms did not, in the records that survive, drop everything to build a German equivalent. The greatest praise the Germans gave the American walkie-talkie was the praise of not knowing what to do with it. Part of the reason was simply that the underlying physics held no secrets. Frequency modulation had been published in the open international engineering literature since Edwin Armstrong's papers of 1933 and 1936. German engineers at the Reichspost, at Telefunken, and at the universities had read those papers, understood them, and even experimented with them in civilian and aviation contexts. The Luftwaffe had built very high-frequency aircraft sets in the same general band, including the FUG-17 close air support transceiver and the later FUG-24, the latter capable of frequency-modulated voice. The results were uneven, and frequency modulation never became standard for German tactical aviation. There was no theoretical mystery inside an opened SCR-300. The 18 vacuum tubes were broadly familiar types. The double superheterodyne receiver was a known architecture. The limiter and discriminator stages, which gave the radio its quiet voice, were standard textbook designs. What was hard to copy was not the theory, it was the system. The American radio combined a wide-band frequency-modulated transmitter, a sensitive double superheterodyne receiver with automatic frequency control, an adjustable squelch circuit, 18 miniature vacuum tubes, a multi-voltage dry battery, a fungicidal coating to keep tropical mold out of the circuits, a single concentric tuning knob that moved the transmitter and receiver together, and a waterproof case that could survive being thrown out of a moving truck. The German army did not have, in 1944, the industrial capacity to build all of those things together at scale in the time it had left. Germany was running out of copper. It was running out of skilled technicians, drafted into the infantry. It was running out of the capacitors and the special-grade quartz that crystal-controlled radios required. It was running out of the very tubes that an American factory in Chicago was producing in quantities of millions. The strategic decisions made before the war about where Germany would invest its electronic engineering effort had also locked the Reich into a path that did not include a frequency-modulated infantry walkie-talkie. German radio research had gone, in enormous quantities, into other priorities, into radar systems like the Würzburg, the Freya, and the Liechtenstein air interception radar carried by night fighters, into navigation systems like Knickerbein, X Gerrit, and Y Gerrit, which guided bombers across blacked-out British cities, into the Y procedure, the system of fighter ground control that vectored Luftwaffe interceptors against American daylight bombing formations, into the radio control systems of the V-2 ballistic missile and the Fi-103 flying bomb, the V-1. Each of these projects consumed engineers, factory floors, and rare materials. The little voice radio that an American sergeant carried on his back was not, in the priorities of the Reich, important enough to win. By the autumn of 1944, the Wehrmacht did finally field its closest equivalent to the American walkie-talkie. Its name was the Kleinfunksprecher D, meaning small radio communicator, Model D. The soldiers who carried it gave it a nickname, Dorette. It was a single-watt amplitude modulated set, operating between 33.8 and 38 MHz, weighing about 2 kilograms. It entered frontline service in October 1944. The war in Europe would end 7 months later. The Dorette was a competent design by the standards of an exhausted nation. It was not, by any honest measure, the equal of an American walkie-talkie that had already been in combat for 15 months. It was amplitude modulated. It carried noise. Its range was a fraction of the American set, and it was issued in numbers far too small to make any difference to the tactical balance of the war. While Germany's industry struggled to catch up, the men who had to fight on the front line found their own ways of using what they had. The most famous of those efforts came in December 1944, on the eve of the German offensive in the Ardennes that the world would come to know as the Battle of the Bulge. On October 22, 1944, Adolf Hitler personally summoned a 36-year-old Austrian Waffen-SS officer named Otto Skorzeny to his headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, in East Prussia. At that meeting, Skorzeny was promoted to SS Obersturmbannführer, the rank equivalent to lieutenant colonel. Skorzeny was already famous. In September 1943, leading a small Waffen-SS contingent alongside a force of Luftwaffe paratroopers under Major Harold Moores, he had snatched the deposed Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from the Hotel Campo Imperatore on the Gran Sasso Massif in central Italy. Hitler now gave him a new mission and a new code name, Operation Greif, the German word for griffin. Skorzeny was to assemble a special brigade equipped with captured American vehicles, weapons, uniforms, and radios. Inside that brigade, Skorzeny would build a smaller commando element called Einheit Stylau, made up of English-speaking volunteers in 2 to 6-man teams. When the German offensive jumped off, those teams would slip through American lines disguised as American soldiers, sow confusion, switch road signs, cut wires, and pass false orders. The training base was at Grafenwöhr, in Bavaria. Skorzeny had asked for 2 American Sherman tanks, 10 armored cars, 20 trucks, 30 jeeps, and 150 men in American uniforms. He received 2 Shermans, one of which broke down almost immediately, 4 armored cars, and around 30 jeeps. The rest, including the tanks his men would actually fight in, were German vehicles, Panthers, Sturmgeschütz assault guns, and half-tracks, disguised with thin sheets of metal cladding and white American stars painted on the sides. The famous Ersatz M10 Panthers, dressed up to look like American tank destroyers, were the work of welders and tinsmiths, not of careful engineering. Among the equipment that Einheit Stylau took into the Ardennes was, in the careful language of the National World War II, museum, jeeps, radios, and some demolition equipment. The records do not specify what kind of radios. They might have been captured SCR 300s. They might have been captured SCR 536s. They might have been German Dorettes painted to look American. The historical record is silent on the model. What the record is not silent on is the operation's actual outcome. Skorzeny himself, in his post-war memoir, claimed that 28 men in 8 teams crossed into American territory. They cut some telephone wires. They turned around some road signs. They spread some rumors. 3 of them, named Pernas, Billing, and Schmidt, were captured at Eiweiler in Belgium on December 17, 1944. Schmidt, under interrogation, blurted out a half-remembered story that Skorzeny intended to assassinate the Allied Supreme Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, in Paris. The story was almost certainly false. It produced, all the same, an extraordinary security lockdown around Eisenhower's headquarters at Versailles, and a wave of jittery checkpoints across the Allied rear. 18 of Skorzeny's commandos were eventually captured, tried by American military tribunals as spies under the laws of war as they then stood, and executed. Skorzeny's brigade itself was repulsed at the village of Malmedy on December 21. The vaunted infiltration of the American radio net, the planting of false orders that would have turned division against division, never happened on any documented scale. The legend grew. The reality stayed small. In the end, the most truthful answer to the question of what the Germans learned from captured American walkie-talkies is not a single dramatic discovery. It is a layered set of observations that German signals officers, German radio engineers, and German commanders made between 1943 and 1945, and that they recorded, when they recorded anything at all, in the careful, dry language of professional men who knew they were losing. They learned, first, that the American radio system was not a single device, but a coherent architecture. The SCR-536 in the Rifle Squad, the SCR-300 in the Rifle Company and at Battalion, the SCR-508 in the tank, the SCR-608 in the Artillery Battery, the SCR-610 tying tanks and infantry together. All of them frequency modulated, all of them in compatible bands, all of them designed to talk to each other and to the airplanes overhead. The German tactical radio family had no such coherence. A Feldfunksprecher in the infantry could not directly speak to an FUG-5 in a tank. A second discovery, harder to admit, was that frequency modulation in the very high-frequency band gave the Americans an interception problem the Germans had not solved. Even when German forward intercept teams managed to listen in on American voice traffic, sitting close to the front line with mobile receivers, they found that the standard German direction-finding methods, which had worked so well against amplitude-modulated traffic in the high-frequency bands, simply did not produce the bearings they needed to locate American units. By the end of the war, the Funkerwehr's 615 Company had become the unhappy specialists in this problem, and their own post-war account is honest enough to say that they never solved it. There was also a paradox. The Americans, while protected by the technology, were not always protected by their own discipline. Prahn's report describes incidents of American radio panic in Normandy, of plain text traffic being broadcast in the clear during moments of confusion, of unit code names being repeated so often that they became as good as identification cards. German forward intercept companies fed off this carelessness, building order of battle maps from the chatter of American operators who did not realize that even very high-frequency voice could be heard by an enemy a kilometer away. The lesson was not that the radio was perfect. The lesson was that the radio was so much better than what the Germans had that even careless American operators were operationally safer than careful German ones. And the most painful lesson of all came last. The gap could not be closed. By the time the Dorette entered service in October 1944, German industrial capacity for tactical radio had collapsed. Allied bombing had hit Telefunken's plants. Workforces had been drained into the infantry. The strategic materials that miniature vacuum tubes required were increasingly under Allied blockade. The decision Roger Colton had made in 1938 at Fort Monmouth had given the United States Army a 6-year head start, and that head start, in time of total war, was insurmountable. The most powerful evidence of what the Germans learned, in the end, is what they did not write. When Allied interrogators sat down with German signals officers in 1945 and 1946, in interrogation centers across Germany and Austria, in the proceedings that produced the document called European Axis Signal Intelligence in World War II, the questions kept turning to cryptography, to the Enigma machine and the Lorenz teleprinter, to Bonifellas and the Black Code, to the breaking of British convoy ciphers by the Naval Intelligence Service known as the B-Dienst. They did not turn often to the little voice radio that an American sergeant had carried on his back. The Germans had no triumphant capture story to tell about it. They had no fielded counter to it. They had no industrial program to build their own version of it. The American walkie-talkie sat on the table between the interrogators and the prisoners had nothing very interesting to say about it. That silence, in a meticulously documented technical bureaucracy, is the deepest answer the historical record provides. To understand how German radio intelligence actually heard the American walkie-talkie when it could hear it at all, it is worth descending for a moment into the daily work of a German forward intercept company in the autumn of 1944. The unit, known as the Long Range Signal Intelligence Company, 613, attached to KONA-5 on the Western Front, operated out of Brittany before the breakout from Normandy forced it eastward. Its men sat in shuttered houses and in the back of converted trucks, hunched over German-built receivers, sweeping through the very high-frequency band with the slow patience that signal intelligence demanded. They wrote down every fragment they heard, call signs, map references in the clear, names of officers shouted in moments of panic, code words used so often that the codes had stopped protecting anything. They sent the fragments back to the KONA-5 Evaluation Center, where translators and analysts pieced them together into a daily intelligence summary that traveled up the chain to Field Marshal Walter Model's headquarters in the West. What those daily summaries reveal, when historians read them today, is not a portrait of broken American radio security. It is a portrait of a German service trying to read a battlefield through a keyhole. The fragments are real, and sometimes valuable, but they are fragments. There is no continuous picture. The intercept operators could hear an American company commander on his SCR-300 for 10 minutes and then lose him for 2 days, because the company had moved 20 miles forward and the German receiver could no longer reach across the new ground. The German listeners knew, in a way that sat heavily on their professional pride, that the men they were listening to could speak to each other across distances and through interference that would have left a German company silent. There were specific cases that became famous within the German signals service, and that surface in the post-war reports. During the fighting in Normandy in late June and July 1944, German forward intercept teams of KONA-5 reported the steady reading of plain text traffic from American infantry units pinned down in the Bocage country. The Americans, faced with the unique horror of fighting through hedgerows that were essentially fortified earthworks, had begun to use their walkie-talkies for tactical coordination at a tempo their training had not prepared them for. Code discipline broke down. Officers called other officers by name. Coordinates were read aloud. The Germans listened, took notes, and where possible adjusted their own dispositions. But the intelligence advantage was always limited by geography. The Germans could read what was directly in front of them. They could not read what 3 valleys away was. The war moved faster than their listening could follow. In the Italian theatre, KONA-7 faced a slightly different problem. The mountainous terrain of the Apennines actually helped the German listeners in places, channeling very high-frequency signals along valleys where mobile receivers could pick them up at ranges of several kilometers. But the same mountains that helped the German listener in one valley denied him the next, and the slow, grinding nature of the Italian campaign meant that even when the Germans built a clear picture of an American unit, that picture was usually obsolete within 48 hours. There was also the question of the language. The German signals service had recruited interpreters from prisoners of war camps, from German citizens who had lived in the United States before 1941, and from the bilingual populations of Alsace and the Sudetenland. They were good. They were not, however, native speakers of every American regional dialect. American voice traffic, particularly from infantry units recruited in the rural South, in Texas, in Appalachia, was sometimes barely intelligible to a German listener in a Brittany basement. The walkie-talkie carried the voice clearly. The voice was still American, in all its strange and varied accents, talking past the German ear as effectively as any cipher. The technical examination of captured sets, when it happened, took place in a network of small German laboratories that the war's end would scatter and the historical record would only partially preserve. The most important of these was the radio research department at Telefunken's facility in Berlin, which had spent the late 1930s and early 1940s on radar and direction finding work for the Reich. After American sets began arriving in numbers, additional small evaluations were performed at the Heer's main radio development laboratory at Berlin-Schöneberg, at facilities of the Lorenz Company at Berlin-Tempelhof, and at smaller workshops attached to the Army's signal training school at Halle. The work that survives in fragmentary form, in the post-war files of the Bundesarchiv, suggests careful technical respect rather than astonishment. German engineers were entirely capable of understanding what they were looking at. They simply did not have the time, the materials, or the political license to redirect German industry to copy it. There is a particular irony in the timeline. By the time the first detailed German technical evaluations of the SCR-300 were circulating in early 1944, the American Army was already shipping the next generation of frequency-modulated tactical radios from its own factories. The SCR-619, a smaller frequency-modulated set developed for vehicular and pack-frame use. The ANVR-C3, a vehicle-mounted adaptation of the SCR-300 itself, riding in jeeps and light vehicles. New crystal frequencies, new antennas, new squelch designs. The American development cycle was not just ahead of the German cycle, it was lapping the German cycle. Even if a German factory had begun work on a perfect copy of the SCR-300 in January 1944, the copy would not have entered service until late 1945, by which time the war in Europe would have been over, and the American sets being faced would have been a generation newer. The German signals officers who saw this most clearly were the ones who had served longest. Lieutenant General Albert Prawn, the last chief of Army and Armed Forces Signal Communications, was a professional soldier who had begun his career as a signals officer in the Imperial German Army during the First World War. His post-war report, drafted between 1948 and 1950 under the supervision of the United States Army Historical Division, has the distance and the honesty that only defeat can produce. Prawn does not blame the Americans for fighting unfairly. He does not blame his own engineers for failing to produce miracles on a starvation budget. He describes, with professional precision, a contest between two communications systems, and he records the outcome without flinching. Some of Prawn's most useful pages concern the changing balance of intercept work as the war moved through 1943 and 1944. He notes that until the summer of 1942, German signal intelligence against the Western Allies was a largely successful enterprise. After that, in his careful phrase, the intercept service began to encounter increasing difficulties. He attributes those difficulties partly to improved Allied cipher security, partly to changes in radio operating procedures, but unmistakably also to the new very high-frequency tactical sets that the Americans had begun to field. He does not give the SCR-300 a name in his report. He simply describes its effects, the way a meteorologist describes a weather front passing through. The other major German voice in the post-war record is Colonel Mettig, who had headed the German Army's Cryptanalytic Center, Inspectorate 7/6, between November 1941 and June 1943. Mettig's testimony, given in interrogation centers in 1945 and 1946, is preserved in the Allied compilation called Target Intelligence Committee, abbreviated TCOM. Mettig spoke at length about code breaking. He spoke about the breaking of American military attaché codes in Cairo. He spoke about the work against the IBM rapid teleprinter known as the radio type. He said almost nothing about the American walkie-talkie. The absence is telling. From the perspective of the senior German cryptanalyst of the war, the small voice radio that an American sergeant carried in his backpack was simply not a cryptographic problem. It was a radio engineering problem, and it had been solved on the wrong side of the front line. Beyond the engineers and the intelligence officers, there were the men in the field. In the Hürtgen forest in October 1944, German battalion communications repeatedly broke down under American artillery, while American infantry units across the firebreaks coordinated easily on their walkie-talkies. In the Ardennes in December 1944, the Feldfunksprecher in a German rifle squad would hiss and crackle with the noise of every tank engine for a kilometer in any direction. The lesson of the captured walkie-talkie, for the men of the Wehrmacht who actually fought against it, was simple and brutal. The Americans could talk to each other. The Germans could not always, not in the same way, not on the same scale. That lesson sank, by the spring of 1945, into the very fabric of how the Wehrmacht fought its final battles. By that point, German tactical planning had stopped trying to compete with American radio. Defensive positions were chosen for terrain advantages that did not depend on radio. Counterattacks were timed for nights and bad weather, when the front line was confused for everyone. The American walkie-talkie had become, in the German tactical imagination, simply another fact of the war, like American air superiority and American artillery superiority, a fact to be worked around rather than answered. There is one more layer to this story, and it concerns the men whose names are not always remembered. Daniel Noble, the engineering director who pushed the project forward at Galvin Manufacturing, would remain at the company for the rest of his career, rising through the 1960s as Group Executive Vice President and serving as Vice Chairman of Motorola, the corporate heir of Galvin, by the early 1970s. He died in 1980. Henryk Magnuski, the Polish radio engineer whose radio frequency design lay at the heart of the SCR-300, was awarded United States citizenship and a series of patents. He briefly considered returning to communist Poland after the war, decided against it, and rebuilt his life in Glenview, Illinois. He died in 1978, his name almost unknown outside the engineering community. Roger Colton, the officer whose 1938 decision shaped the war, retired as a major general and died in 1972. Edwin Howard Armstrong, the inventor of frequency modulation, the man whose patents made the entire American tactical radio system possible, took his own life on January 31, 1954. after years of patent litigation against the Radio Corporation of America had drained his health and his fortune. He never lived to see the full peacetime triumph of the technology he had given the United States Army for free during the war. And the radios themselves. Most of the nearly 50,000 SCR-300s and 130,000 SCR-536s that rolled out of American factories were declared surplus after 1945. Some were given to the new armies of post-war Europe. Some were sold off through army surplus stores in the late 1940s and the 1950s, where amateur radio enthusiasts and police departments bought them for next to nothing. A few survive today, restored by collectors, their green metal cases scratched and dented, their batteries long dead, their original crystal frequencies forgotten. They sit in private collections, in the United States Army Signal Corps Museum at Fort Gordon in Georgia, and at the Motorola Heritage Center in Schaumburg, Illinois, the corporate descendant of the Chicago factory where Galvin Manufacturing built them. The captured German radios followed a different fate. After the war, surrendered Wehrmacht equipment was collected, evaluated, and largely scrapped. A small number of Doretts, Feldfunksprechers, and Tonfunk sets were preserved by the new Bundeswehr, by museums in Munich, Dresden, and Koblenz, and by private collectors of military electronics. They tell the German half of the story. They are also, in their own way, eloquent about what was lost. The engineering inside them is honest, careful work by good engineers. The strategic decisions that shaped them, the priorities that left them noisy and short-ranged while their American opposites grew clear and far-reaching, were decisions made over their heads, in offices in Berlin. In 1938 and 1939, before the first shot of the war was fired, the contest between the American walkie-talkie and the German tactical radio was not, in the end, a contest between engineers. It was a contest between two systems of priorities. The United States Army, in the person of Roger Colton, had bet on a single, unproven technology in 1938, and that bet had paid off in clear voice on the battlefield from the jungles of New Georgia to the snow of the Ardennes. The Wehrmacht, with the most distinguished radio tradition in continental Europe, had spread its bets across radar, navigation, missile guidance, and aircraft control, and had left the foot soldier with what an American technical intelligence summary, written in January 1944, called a radio that operated at theoretically about one-fourth the distance over which American sets could operate. The walkie-talkie was not the weapon that won the war. Tanks, aircraft, ships, artillery, and the men who used them won the war. But the walkie-talkie was one of the threads, almost invisible to the soldiers who carried it, that quietly tilted the small contest of every engagement, every patrol, every ambush, every house-to-house fight in favor of the side that had it. A radio that worked under fire, in the rain, in the dust, in the cold, in the hands of an exhausted private who had never been trained as a radio operator. There was a force multiplier of a kind that armies before 1943 had not imagined possible. The Germans, listening from the other side of the line, eventually understood that. They simply could not answer it. Today, when a hiker on a mountain pass clicks the button on a small plastic handheld and speaks to a friend 2 valleys away, when a film crew on a movie set coordinates a complex shot, when a security guard at a stadium calls for backup, the device in their hand is the direct technological grandchild of the green metal box that an American sergeant carried up Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. Frequency modulation, squelch, push-to-talk, the very phrase walkie-talkie. All of it came out of a wartime collaboration between an American immigrant engineer, a Polish immigrant engineer, an army officer who made a difficult decision in peacetime, and an inventor who gave his life's work to the United States government for the duration of the conflict. The German signals officers who studied the captured sets in their hidden laboratories, who wrote their careful reports for headquarters in Berlin, who interrogated the prisoners and questioned the deserters and evaluated the wreckage from 100 captured American command posts, came to understand all of this. They understood it as professionals, as patriots, and as men who would, in many cases, end the war as prisoners themselves, sitting across a table from Allied interrogators who asked them careful questions about everything except the small green box that had quietly helped to defeat them. That silence, written into the German post-war interrogation files, is the truest thing the captured radios ever taught.